preparations for retiring had to be of a very primitive character. "Shall we not light a large fire for the night?" Dick Sand asked the American. "What's the good?" replied Harris. "Fortunately, the nights are not cold, and this enormous mango will preserve the soil from all evaporation. We have neither cold nor dampness to fear. I repeat, my young friend, what I told you just now. Let us move along incognito. No more fire than gunshots, if possible." "I believe, indeed," then said Mrs. Weldon, "that we have nothing to fear from the Indians, even from those wanderers of the woods of whom you have spoken, Mr. Harris. But are there not other four-footed wanderers that the sight of a fire would help to keep at a distance?" "Mrs. Weldon," replied the American, "you do too much honor to the deer of this country. Indeed, they fear man more than he fears them." "We are in a wood," said Jack, "and there is always beasts in the woods." "There are woods and woods, my good little man, as there are beasts and beasts," replied Harris, laughing. "Imagine that you are in the middle of a large park. Truly, it is not without reason that the Indians say of this country, Es como el paraíso. It is like an earthly paradise." "Then there are serpents," said Jack. "No, my Jack," replied Mrs. Weldon, "there are no serpents, and you may sleep tranquilly." "And lions?" asked Jack. "Not the ghost of a lion, my good little man," replied Harris. "Tigers, then?" "Ask your mamma if she has ever heard tell of tigers on this continent." "Never," replied Mrs. Weldon. "Good," said Cousin Benedict, who, by chance, was listening to the conversation. "If there are neither lions nor tigers in the New World, which is perfectly true, we at least encounter cougars and jaguars." "Are they bad?" asked little Jack. "Few," replied Harris. "A native has little fear of attacking those animals, and we are strong. Stay, Hercules would be strong enough to crush 2 jaguars at once, one in each hand." "You will watch well, Hercules," then said little Jack, "and if a beast comes to bite us—" "It is I who will bite it, Mr. Jack," replied Hercules, showing his mouth armed with superb teeth. "Yes, you will watch, Hercules," said the novice, "but your companions and I will relieve you turnabout." "No, Mr. Dick," replied Actaeon. "Hercules, Bat, Austin, and I, we 4 will be enough for this labor. You must rest the whole night." "Thank you, Actaeon," replied Dick Sand, "but I ought to." "No, let those brave men do it, my dear Dick," then said Mrs. Weldon. I shall watch," added little Jack, whose eyelids were already closing. "Yes, my Jack, yes, you will watch," replied his mother, who did not wish to contradict him. "But," the little boy said again, "if there are no lions, if there are no tigers in the forest, there are wolves." "Oh, wolves in jest," replied the American. "They are not even wolves, but kinds of foxes, or rather of those dogs of the woods which they call garas." "And those garas they bite?" asked little Jack. "Bah, Dingo would make only one mouthful of those beasts." "Never mind," replied Jack with a last yawn. "Garas are wolves because they are called wolves." And with that Jack fell asleep peaceably in Nan's arms, beside the trunk of the mango. Mrs. Weldon, lying near her, gave a last kiss to her little boy, and her tired eyes quickly closed for the night. A few moments later Hercules brought back to the camp Cousin Benedict, who had just gone off to commence a chase for pyrophores. They are cocuyos, or luminous flies, which the stylish put in their hair, like so many living gems. These insects, which throw a bright and bluish light from 2 spots situated at the base of their corselet, are very numerous in South America. Cousin Benedict then counted on making a large collection, but Hercules did not leave him time, and, in spite of his recriminations, the Negro brought him to the halting place. That was because, when Hercules had orders, he executed them with military preciseness, which, no doubt, prevented the incarceration of a notable quantity of luminous flies in the entomologist's tin box. A few moments after, with the exception of the giant, who was watching, all were reposing in a profound sleep. Chapter 17. 100 miles in 2 days. Generally, travelers or ramblers in the woods who have slept in the forests under the lovely stars are awakened by howlings as fantastic as disagreeable. There is everything in this morning concert: clucking, grunting, croaking, sneering, barking, and almost speaking, if one may make use of this word, which completes the series of different noises. There are the monkeys who thus salute the daybreak. There we meet the little marikina, the marmoset with a speckled mask, the mono gris, the skin of which the Indians used to recover the batteries of their guns, the sagas, recognizable from their long bunches of hair, and many others, specimens of this numerous family. Of these various four-handed animals, the most remarkable are decidedly the garibas, with curling tails and a face like Beelzebub. When the sun rises, the oldest of the band, with an imposing and mysterious voice, sings a monotonous psalm. It is the baritone of the troupe. The young tenors repeat after him the morning symphony. The Indians say then that the garibas recite their paternosters. But on this day it seemed that the monkeys did not offer their prayer, for no one heard them. And meanwhile their voice is loud, for it is produced by the rapid vibration of a kind of bony drum, formed by a swelling of the hyoid's bone in the neck. In short, for one reason or for another, neither the garibas, nor the sagas, nor any other four-handed animals of this immense forest, sang, on this morning, their usual concert. This would not have satisfied the wandering Indians. Not that these natives appreciate this kind of strange choral music, but they willingly give chase to the monkeys, and if they do, it is because the flesh of this animal is excellent, above all, when it is smoke-dried. Dick Sand, of course, could not be familiar with the habits of the Garibas, neither were his companions, or this not hearing them would have undoubtedly been a subject of surprise. They awoke then, one after the other, much refreshed by these few hours of repose, which no alarm had come to disturb. Little Jack was not the last to stretch his arms. His first question was to ask if Hercules had eaten a wolf during the night. No wolf had shown himself, and consequently Hercules had not yet breakfasted. All besides were fasting like him, and after the morning prayer, Nan occupied herself preparing the repast. The bill of fare was that of the supper of the night before, but with appetites sharpened by the morning air of the forest, no one dreamed of being difficult to please. It was necessary, above all, to gather strength for a good day's march, and they did it. For the first time, perhaps, Cousin Benedict comprehended that to eat was not an action indifferent or useless to life. Only, he declared that he had not come to visit this country to walk with his hands in his pockets, and that, if Hercules prevented him from chasing the cucuyos and other luminous flies, Hercules would have some trouble with him. This threat did not seem to frighten the giant to any great extent. However, Mrs. Weldon took him aside and told him that, perhaps, he might allow his big baby to run to the right and left, but on condition that he did not lose sight of him. It would not do to completely sever Cousin Benedict from the pleasures so natural to his age. At 7 o'clock in the morning, the little troop took up their journey toward the east, preserving the order of march that had been adopted the previous day. It was always the forest. On this virgin soil, where the heat and the moisture agreed to produce vegetation, it might well be thought that the reign of growth appeared in all its power. The parallel of this vast plateau was almost confounded with tropical latitudes, and during certain months in summer, the sun, in passing to the zenith, darted its perpendicular rays there. There was, therefore, an enormous quantity of imprisoned heat in this earth, of which the subsoil preserved the damp. Also, nothing could be more magnificent than this succession of forests, or rather this interminable forest. Meanwhile, Dick Sand had not failed to observe this, that, according to Harris, they were in the region of the Pampas. Now, Pampas is a word from the Quichua language, which signifies a plain. Now, if his recollections did not deceive him, he believed that these plains presented the following characteristics: lack of water, absence of trees, a failure of stones, an almost luxuriant abundance of thistles during the rainy season, thistles which became almost shrubby with the warm season, and then formed impenetrable thickets. Then also dwarf trees, thorny shrubs, the whole giving to these plains a rather arid and desolate aspect. Now it had not been thus since the little troop, guided by the American, had left the coast. The forest had not ceased to spread to the limits of the horizon. No, this was not the Pampas, such as the young novice had imagined them. Had nature, as Harris had told him, been able to make a region apart from the plateau of Atacama, of which he knew nothing, if it did not form one of the most vast deserts of South America, between the Andes and the Pacific Ocean? On that day, Dick Sand propounded some questions on this subject, and expressed to the American the surprise he felt at this singular appearance of the Pampas. But he was quickly undeceived by Harris, who gave him the most exact details about this part of Bolivia, thus witnessing to his great knowledge of the country. "You are right, my young friend," he said to the novice. "The true Pampa is indeed such as the books of travels have depicted it to you, That is, a plain rather arid, and the crossing of which is often difficult. It recalls our savannas of North America, except that these are a little marshy. Yes, such is indeed the pampa of the Rio Colorado, such are the llanos of the Orinoco and of Venezuela. But here, we are in a country, the appearance of which even astonishes me. It is true, it is the first time I have followed this route across the plateau, a route which has the advantage of shortening our journey. But if I have not yet seen it, I know that it presents an extraordinary contrast to the veritable pampa. As to this one, you would find it again, not between the Cordilleras of the West and the high chain of the Andes, but beyond the mountains, over all that eastern part of the continent which extends as far as the Atlantic. Must we then clear the Andes range? Dick Sand asked quickly. No, my young friend, no, replied the American, smiling. So I said, you would find it again, and not, you will find it again. Be reassured, we shall not leave this plateau, the greatest elevations of which do not exceed 1,500 feet. Ah, if it had been necessary to cross the Cordilleras with only the means of transport at our disposal, I should never have drawn you into such an undertaking. In fact, replied Dick Sand, it would be better to ascend or descend the coast. Oh, 100 times, replied Harris, but the farm of San Felice is situated on this side of the Cordilleras. So then, our journey, neither in its first nor in its second part, will offer any real difficulty. And you do not fear going astray in these forests which you cross for the first time? Asked Dick Sand. No, my young friend, no, replied Harris. I know indeed that this forest is like an immense sea, or rather like the bottom of a sea, where a sailor himself could not take the latitude nor recognize his position. But accustomed to traveling in the woods, I know how to find my route only by the inclination of certain trees, by the direction of their leaves, by the movement or the composition of the soil, by 1,000 details which escape you. Be sure of it, I will lead you, you and yours, where you ought to go. All these things were said very clearly by Harris. Dick Sand and he, at the head of the troop, often talked without anyone mingling in their conversation. If the novice felt some doubts that the American did not always succeed in scattering, he preferred to keep them to himself. The 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and of April passed in this manner, without any incident to mark the journey. They did not make more than 8 to 9 miles in 12 hours. The times consecrated to eating or repose came at regular intervals, and though a little fatigue was felt already, the sanitary condition was still very satisfactory. Little Jack began to suffer a little from this life in the woods, to which he was not accustomed, and which was becoming very monotonous for him. And then all the promises which had been made him had not been kept. The caoutchouc jumping jacks, the humming birds, all those seemed constantly to recede. There had also been a question of showing him the most beautiful parrots in the world, and they ought not to be wanting in these rich forests. Where then were the popinjays with green plumage, almost all originally from these countries? The aras with naked cheeks, with long pointed tails, with glittering colors whose paws never rest on the earth, and the camins, which are more peculiar to tropical countries, and the many-colored she-parrots with feathered faces, and finally all those prattling birds which, according to the Indians, still speak the language of extinct tribes. Of parrots, little Jack only saw ash-gray joccos, with red tails, which abounded under the trees. But these joccos were not new to him. They have transported them into all parts of the world. On the 2 continents they fill the houses with their insupportable chattering, and of all the family of the cetaceous, they are the ones which learn to speak most easily. It must be said, besides, that if Jack was not contented, Cousin Benedict was no more so. He had been allowed to wander a little to the right or to the left during the march. However, he had not found any insect which was fit to enrich his collection. Even the pyrophores obstinately refused to show themselves to him and attract him by the phosphorescences of their corslet. Nature seemed truly to mock the unhappy entomologist, whose temper was becoming cross. For 4 days more, the march toward the northeast was continued in the same way. On the 16th of April, the distance traversed from the coast could not be estimated at less than 100 miles. If Harris had not gone astray, and he affirmed it without hesitation, the farm of San Felice was no more than 20 miles from the halting place of that day. Before 48 hours, the little troop then would have a comfortable shelter where its members could at last repose from their fatigues. Meanwhile, though the plateau had been almost entirely crossed in its middle part, not a native, not a wanderer had been encountered under the immense forest. More than once, without saying anything about it, Dick Sand regretted being unable to go ashore on some other point of the coast. More to the south, or more to the north, villages, hamlets, or plantations would not have been lacking, and long before this, Mrs. Weldon and her companions would have found an asylum. But if the country seemed to be abandoned by man, animals showed themselves more frequently during these last days. At times was heard a kind of long, plaintive cry that Harris attributed to some of those large tardigrades, habitual denizens of those vast wooded regions, named eyes. On that day, also during the midday halt, a hissing passed through the air, which made Mrs. Weldon very uneasy, because it was so strange. "What is that?" she asked, rising hastily. "A serpent," cried Dick Sand, who, gun in hand, threw himself before Mrs. Weldon. They might fear, in fact, that some reptile would glide among the plants to the halting place. It would be nothing astonishing if it were one of those enormous, sucurous kinds of boas, which sometimes measure 40 feet in length. But Harris reminded Dick Sand that the blacks were already following, and he reassured Mrs. Weldon. According to him, that hissing could not be produced by a sucuru, because that serpent does not hiss. But he indicated the presence of several inoffensive quadrupeds, rather numerous in that country. "Be reassured, then," said he, "and make no movement which may frighten those animals." "But what are they?" asked Dick Sand, who made it like a law of conscience to interrogate and make the American speak, who, however, never required pressing before replying. "They are antelopes, my young friend," replied Harris. "Oh, how I should like to see them," cried Jack. "That is very difficult, my good little man," replied the American, "very difficult." "Perhaps we may try to approach, then, those hissing antelopes?" returned Dick Sand. "Oh, you will not take 3 steps," replied the American, shaking his head, "before the whole band will take flight. I beg of you, then, not to trouble yourself." But Dick Sand had his reasons for being curious. He wished to see, and, gun in hand, he glided among the herbs. Immediately a dozen graceful gazelles, with small, sharp horns, passed with the rapidity of a waterspout. Their hair, bright red, looked like a cloud of fire under the tall underwood of the forest. "I had warned you," said Harris, when the novice returned to take his place. Those antelopes were so light of foot that it had been truly impossible to distinguish them, but it was not so with another troop of animals which was signaled the same day. Those could be seen, imperfectly, it is true, but their apparition led to a rather singular discussion between Harris and some of his companions. The little troop, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, had stopped for a moment near an opening in the woods, when 3 or 4 animals of great height went out of a thicket 100 steps off, and scampered away at once with remarkable speed. In spite of the American's recommendations, this time the novice, having quickly shouldered his gun, fired at one of these animals. But at the moment when the charge was going off, the weapon had been rapidly turned aside by Harris, and Dick Sand, skillful as he was, had missed his aim. No firing," said the American. "Ah, now, but those are giraffes," cried Dick Sand, without otherwise replying to Harris's observation. "Giraffes," repeated Jack, standing up on the horse's saddle. "Where are they, the large beasts?" "Giraffes," replied Mrs. Weldon. "You are mistaken, my dear Dick. There are no giraffes in America." "Indeed," said Harris, who appeared rather surprised, "there cannot be any giraffes in this country." "What then?" said Dick Sand. "I really do not know what to think," replied Harris. "Have not your eyes deceived you, my young friend, and are not those animals more likely to be ostriches?" "Ostriches," repeated Dick Sand and Mrs. Weldon, looking at each other in great surprise. "Yes, only ostriches," repeated Harris. "But ostriches are birds," returned Dick Sand, "and consequently they have only 2 feet." "Well," replied Harris, "I indeed thought I saw that those animals, which have just made off so rapidly, were bipeds." "Bipeds," replied the novice. "Indeed it seemed to me that I saw animals with 4 legs," then said Mrs. Weldon. "I also," added old Tom, then Bat, Actaeon and Austin confirmed those words. "Ostriches with 4 legs," cried Harris with a burst of laughter. "That would be ridiculous." "So," returned Dick Sand, "we have believed they were giraffes and not ostriches." "No, my young friend, no," said Harris. "You have certainly seen badly. That is explained by the rapidity with which those animals have flown away. Besides, it has happened more than once that hunters have been deceived like you, and in the best faith in the world." What the American said was very plausible. Between an ostrich of great height and a giraffe of medium height, Seen at a certain distance, it is easy to make a mistake. If it were a question of a beak or a nose, both are nonetheless joined to the end of a long neck turned backward, and strictly speaking, it may be said that an ostrich is only a half giraffe. It only needs the hind legs. Then this biped and this quadruped, passing rapidly, on a sudden may, very properly, be taken one for the other. Besides, the best proof that Mrs. Weldon and the others were mistaken was that there are no giraffes in America. Dick Sand then made this reflection. But I believed that ostriches were not met with in the New World any more than giraffes. Yes, my young friend, replied Harris, and indeed South America possesses a peculiar species. To this species belongs the Nandan, which you have just seen. Harris spoke the truth. The Nandan is a long-legged bird, rather common in the plains of South America, and its flesh, when it is young, is good to eat. This strong animal, whose height sometimes exceeds 2 meters, has a straight beak, wings long and formed of tufted feathers of a bluish shade, feet formed of 3 claws furnished with nails, which essentially distinguishes it from the ostriches of Africa. These very exact details were given by Harris, who appeared to be very strongly posted on the manners of the Nandans. Mrs. Weldon and her companions were obliged to acknowledge that they had been deceived. Besides, added Harris, possibly we may encounter another band of these ostriches. Well, next time look better and no longer allow yourselves to take birds for quadrupeds. But above all, my young friend, do not forget my recommendations, and do not fire on any animal whatsoever. We have no need of hunting to procure food, and no detonation of a firearm must announce our presence in this forest. Meanwhile, Dick Sand remained pensive. Once more a doubt had just arisen on his mind. The next day, Apith, the march was continued, and the American affirmed that 24 hours would not pass before the little troop should be installed at the farm of San Felice. There, Mrs. Weldon, added he, you will receive all the care necessary to your position, and a few days' rest will quite restore you. Perhaps you will not find at this farm the luxury to which you are accustomed in your residence in San Francisco, but you will see that our improved lands in the interior do not lack what is comfortable. We are not absolutely savages. Mr. Harris, replied Mrs. Weldon, if we have only thanks to offer you for your generous resort, at least we shall offer them to you with all our hearts. Yes, it is time for us to arrive there. You are very much fatigued, Mrs. Weldon. No matter, replied Mrs. Weldon, but I perceive that my little Jack is gradually becoming exhausted. The fever begins to affect him at certain hours. Yes, replied Harris, and although the climate of this plateau is very healthful, it must be acknowledged that in March and April intermittent fevers reign. Doubtless, then said Dick Sand, but also nature, who is always and everywhere provident, has put the remedy near the evil. And how is that, my young friend? Asked Harris, who did not seem to understand. Are we not then in the region of the quinquinas? Replied Dick Sand. In fact, said Harris, you are perfectly right. The trees which furnish the precious febrifuge bark are native here. I am even astonished, added Dick Sand, that we have not yet seen a single one. Ah, my young friend, replied Harris, those trees are not easy to distinguish. Though they are often of great height, though their leaves are large, their flowers rosy and odoriferous, we do not discover them easily. It is rarely that they grow in groups. They are rather scattered through the forests, and the Indians who collect the quinquina can only recognize them by their foliage, always green. Mr. Harris, said Mrs. Weldon, if you see one of those trees you will show it to me. Certainly, Mrs. Weldon, but at the farm you will find some sulfate of quinine. That is worth still more to break the fever than the simple bark of the tree. Formerly, this bark was only reduced to powder, which bore the name of Jesuits' powder, because, in 1649, the Jesuits of Rome received a considerable quantity from their mission in America. This last day of the journey passed without other incident. Evening came and the halt was organized for the whole night as usual. Till then it had not rained, but the weather was preparing to change, for a warm mist rose from the soil and soon found a thick fog. They were touching, in fact, on the rainy season. Fortunately, the next day, a comfortable shelter would be hospitably offered to the little troop. There were only a few hours to elapse. Though, according to Harris, who could only establish his calculation by the time which the journey had lasted, they could not be more than 6 miles from the farm, the ordinary precautions were taken for the night. Tom and his companions would watch one after the other. Dick Sand insisted that nothing should be neglected in that respect. Less than ever would he depart from his habitual prudence, for a terrible suspicion was encrusted in his mind, but he did not wish to say anything yet. The retiring to rest had been made at the feet of a group of large trees. Fatigue aiding, Mrs. Weldon and hers were already asleep, when they were awakened by a great cry. What's the matter?" asked Dick Sand quickly, who was on his feet first of all. It is I who have cried," replied Cousin Benedict. And what is the matter with you?" asked Mrs. Weldon. I have just been bit. By a serpent?" asked Mrs. Weldon with alarm. No, no, it was not a serpent but an insect, replied Cousin Benedict. Oh, I have it. Well, crush your insect, said Harris, and let us sleep, Mr. Benedict. Crush an insect, cried Cousin Benedict. Not so, I must see what it is. Some mosquito, said Harris, shrugging his shoulders. No, it is a fly, replied Cousin Benedict, and a fly which ought to be very curious. Dick Sand had lit a little portable lantern, and he approached Cousin Benedict. Divine goodness, cried the latter. Behold what consoles me for all my deceptions. I have then at last made a discovery. The honest man was raving. He looked at his fly in triumph. He would willingly kiss it. But what is it then? Asked Mrs. Weldon. A dipter, cousin, a famous dipter. And Cousin Benedict showed a fly smaller than a bee, of a dull color, streaked with yellow on the lower part of its body. And this fly is not venomous? Asked Mrs. Weldon. No, cousin, no, at least not for man. But for animals, for antelopes, for buffaloes, even for elephants, it is another thing. Ah, adorable insect. At last, asked Dick Sand, will you tell us, Mr. Benedict, what is this fly? This fly, replied the entomologist, this fly that I hold between my fingers, this fly, it is a tsetse. It is that famous dipter that is the honor of a country, and till now, no one has ever found a tsetse in America. Dick Sand did not dare to ask Cousin Benedict in what part of the world this redoubtable tsetse was only to be met. And when his companions, after this incident, had returned to their interrupted sleep, Dick Sand, in spite of the fatigue which overwhelmed him, did not close his eyes the whole night. Chapter 18. The Terrible Word. It was time to arrive. Extreme lassitude made it impossible for Mrs. Weldon to continue any longer a journey made under such painful conditions. Her little boy, crimson during the fits of fever, very pale during the intermissions, was pitiable to see. His mother, extremely anxious, had not been willing to leave Jack even in the care of the good Nan. She held him, half lying in her arms. Yes, it was time to arrive. But to trust to the American, on the very evening of this day which was breaking, the evening of the 18th of April, the little troop should finally reach the shelter of the hacienda of San Feliz. 12 days' journey for a woman, 12 nights passed in the open air. It was enough to overwhelm Mrs. Weldon, energetic as she was. But for a child, it was worse, and the sight of little Jack sick, and without the most ordinary cares, had sufficed to crush her. Dick Sand, Nan, Tom, and his companions had supported the fatigues of the journey better. Their provisions, although they were commencing to get exhausted, had not become injured, and their condition was satisfactory. As for Harris, he seemed made for the difficulties of these long journeys across the forests, and it did not appear that fatigue could affect him. Only, in proportion as he neared the farm, Dick Sand observed that he was more preoccupied and less frank in behavior than before. The contrary would have been more natural. This was, at least, the opinion of the young novice, who had now become more than suspicious of the American. And meanwhile, what interest could Harris have in deceiving them? Dick Sand could not have explained it, but he watched their guide more closely. The American probably felt himself suspected by Dick Sand, and, no doubt, it was this mistrust which made him still more taciturn with his young friend. The march had been resumed. In the forest, less thick, the trees were scattered in groups, and no longer formed impenetrable masses. Was it, then, the true pampas of which Harris had spoken? During the first hours of the day, no accident happened to aggravate the anxieties that Dick Sand felt. Only 2 facts were observed by him. Perhaps they were not very important, but in these actual junctures, no detail could be neglected. It was the behavior of Dingo which, above all, attracted more especially the young man's attention. In fact, the dog, which during all this journey had seemed to be following a scent, became quite different, and that almost suddenly. Until then, his nose to the ground, generally smelling the herbs or the shrubs, he either kept quiet or he made a sort of sad, barking noise, like an expression of grief or of regret. Now, on this day, the barking of the singular animal became like bursts, sometimes furious, such as they formerly were when Negoro appeared on the deck of the Pilgrim. A suspicion crossed suddenly Dick Sand's mind, and it was confirmed by Tom, who said to him, "How very singular, Mr. Dick. Dingo no longer smells the ground as he did yesterday. His nose is in the air, he is agitated, his hair stands up. One would think he scented in the distance." "Negoro, is it not so?" replied Dick Sand, who seized the old black's arm and signed to him to speak in a low voice. "Negoro, Mr. Dick, may it not be that he has followed our steps?" "Yes, Tom, and that at this moment even he may not be very far from us." "But why?" said Tom. "Either Negoro does not know this country," went on Dick Sand, "and then he would have every interest in not losing sight of us. Or," said Tom, who anxiously regarded the novice. "Or," replied Dick Sand, "he does know it and then he." "But how should Negoro know this country? He has never come here." "Has he never been here?" murmured Dick Sand. "It is an incontestable fact that Dingo acts as if this man whom he detests were near us." Then, interrupting himself to call the dog, which, after some hesitation, came to him. Said he, "Negoro, Negoro." A furious barking was Dingo's reply. This name had its usual effect upon him, and he darted forward, as if Negoro had been hidden behind some thicket. Harris had witnessed all this scene. With his lips a little drawn, he approached the novice. "What did you ask Dingo then?" said he. "Oh, not much, Mr. Harris," replied old Tom jokingly. "We asked him for news of the ship companion whom we have lost." "Ah," said the American, "the Portuguese, the ship's cook of whom you have already spoken to me." "Yes," replied Tom. "One would say to hear Dingo that Negoro is in the vicinity." "How could he get as far as this?" replied Harris. "He never was in this country that I know of. At least, he concealed it from us," replied Tom. "It would be astonishing," said Harris. "But if you wish, we will beat these thickets. It is possible that this poor devil has need of help, that he is in distress." "It is useless, Mr. Harris," replied Dick Sand. "If Negoro has known how to come as far as this, he will know how to go farther. He is a man to keep out of trouble." "As you please," replied Harris. "Let us go. Dingo, be quiet," added Dick Sand briefly, so as to end the conversation. The second observation made by the novice was in connection with the American horse. He did not appear to feel the stable, as do animals of his species. He did not suck in the air, he did not hasten his speed, he did not dilate his nostrils, he uttered none of the neighings that indicate the end of a journey. To observe him well, he appeared to be as indifferent as if the farm, to which he had gone several times, however, and which he ought to know, had been several hundreds of miles away. "That is not a horse near home," thought the young novice. And meanwhile, according to what Harris had said the evening before, there only remained 6 miles to go, and, of these last 6 miles, at 5 o'clock in the evening 4 had been certainly cleared. Now, if the horse felt nothing of the stable, of which he should have great need, nothing besides announced the approaches to a great clearing, such as the farm of Sanfellis must be. Mrs. Weldon, indifferent as she then was to what did not concern her child, was struck at seeing the country still so desolate. What? Not a native, not a farm servant at such a short distance. Harris must be wild. No, she repulsed this idea. A new delay would have been the death of her little Jack. Meanwhile, Harris always kept in advance, but he seemed to observe the depths of the wood, and looked to the right and left, like a man who was not sure of himself, nor of his road. Mrs. Weldon shut her eyes so as not to see him. After a plain a mile in extent, the forest, without being as dense as in the west, had reappeared, and the little troop was again lost under the great trees. At 6 o'clock in the evening they had reached a thicket, which appeared to have recently given passage to a band of powerful animals. Dick Sand looked around him very attentively. At a distance which far surpassed the human height, the branches were torn off or broken. At the same time the herbs, roughly scattered, exhibited on the soil, a little marshy, prints of steps which could not be those of jaguars or cougars. Were these, then, the eyes, or some other tardigrades whose feet had thus marked the soil? But how, then, explain the break in the branches at such a height? Elephants might have, without doubt, left such imprints, stamped these large traces, made a similar hole in the impenetrable underwood. But elephants are not found in America. These enormous thick-skinned quadrupeds are not natives of the New World. As yet, they have never been acclimated there. The hypothesis that elephants had passed there was absolutely inadmissible. However that might be, Dick Sand hardly knew how much this inexplicable fact gave him to think about. He did not even question the American on this point. What could he expect from a man who had tried to make him take giraffes for ostriches? Harris would have given him some explanation, more or less imaginative, which would not have changed the situation. At all events, Dick had formed his opinion of Harris. He felt in him a traitor. He only awaited an occasion to unmask his disloyalty, to have the right to do it, and everything told him that this opportunity was near. But what could be Harris's secret end? What future, then, awaited the survivors of the Pilgrim? Dick Sand repeated to himself that his responsibility had not ceased with the shipwreck. It was more than ever necessary for him to provide for the safety of those whom the waves had thrown on this coast. This woman, this young child, these blacks, all his companions in misfortune, it was he alone who must save them. But if he could attempt anything on board ship, if he could act on the sea, here, in the midst of the terrible trials which he foresaw, what part could he take? Dick Sand would not shut his eyes before the frightful reality that each instant made more indisputable. In this juncture he again became the captain of 15 years, as he had been on the Pilgrim. But he would not say anything which could alarm the poor mother before the moment for action had arrived. And he said nothing, not even when, arrived on the bank of a rather large stream, preceding the little troop about 100 feet, he perceived enormous animals, which threw themselves under the large plants on the brink. Hippopotami, hippopotami, he was going to exclaim. And they were, indeed, these thick-skinned animals, with a big head, a large, swollen snout, a mouth armed with teeth which extend a foot beyond it, animals which are squat on their short limbs, the skin of which, unprovided with hair, is of a tawny red. Hippopotam in America. They continued to march during the whole day, but painfully. Fatigue commenced to retard even the most robust. It was truly time to arrive, or they would be forced to stop. Mrs. Weldon, wholly occupied with her little Jack, did not perhaps feel the fatigue, but her strength was exhausted. All, more or less, were tired. Dick Sand, resisted by a supreme moral energy, caused by the sentiment of duty. Toward 4 o'clock in the evening, old Tom found, in the grass, an object which attracted his attention. It was an arm, a kind of knife of a particular shape, formed of a large, curved blade, set in a square, ivory handle rather roughly ornamented. Tom carried this knife to Dick Sand, who took it, examined it, and finally showed it to the American, saying, "No doubt the natives are not very far off." "That is so," replied Harris, "and meanwhile—" "Meanwhile," repeated Dick Sand, who now steadily looked Harris in the face. "We should be very near the farm," replied Harris, hesitating, "and I do not recognize—" "You are then astray?" quickly asked Dick Sand. "Astray? No. The farm cannot be more than 3 miles away now. But I wish to take the shortest road through the forest, and perhaps I have made a little mistake." "Perhaps," replied Dick Sand. "I would do well, I think, to go in advance," said Harris. "No, Mr. Harris, we will not separate," replied Dick Sand in a decided tone. "As you will," replied the American, "but during the night it will be difficult for me to guide you." "Never mind that," replied Dick Sand. "We are going to halt, Mrs. Weldon will consent to pass a last night under the trees, and tomorrow, when it is broad daylight, we will proceed on our journey. 2 or 3 miles still, that will be an hour's walk." "Be it so," replied Harris. At that moment, Dingo commenced to bark furiously. "Here, Dingo, here," cried Dick Sand. "You know well that no one is there and that we are in the desert." This last halt was then decided upon. Mrs. Weldon let her companions work without saying a word. Her little Jack was sleeping in her arms, made drowsy by the fever. They sought the best place to pass the night. This was under a large bunch of trees, where Dick Sand thought of disposing all for their rest. But old Tom, who was helping him in these preparations, stopped suddenly, crying out, "Mr. Dick, look, look." "What is it, old Tom?" asked Dick Sand, in the calm tone of a man who attends to everything. "There, there," cried Tom, "on those trees blood stains, and on the ground mutilated limbs." Dick Sand rushed toward the spot indicated by old Tom. Then, returning to him, "Silence, Tom, silence," said he. In fact, there on the ground were hands cut off, and above these human remains were several broken forks and a chain in pieces. Happily, Mrs. Weldon had seen nothing of this horrible spectacle. As for Harris, he kept at a distance, and anyone observing him at this moment would have been struck at the change made in him. His face had something ferocious in it. Dingo had rejoined Dick Sand, and before these bloody remains, he barked with rage. The novice had hard work to drive him away. Meanwhile, old Tom, at the sight of these forks of this broken chain, had remained motionless, as if his feet were rooted in the soil. His eyes were wide open, his hands clenched. He stared, murmuring these incoherent words. "I have seen, already seen, these forks, when little I have seen." And no doubt the memories of his early infancy returned to him vaguely. He tried to recall them. He was going to speak. "Be silent, Tom," repeated Dick Sand. "For Mrs. Weldon's sake, for all our sakes, be silent." And the novice led the old black away. Another halting place was chosen, at some distance, and all was arranged for the night. The repast was prepared, but they hardly touched it. Fatigue took away their hunger. All were under an indefinable impression of anxiety which bordered on terror. Darkness came gradually, soon it was profound. The sky was covered with great stormy clouds. Between the trees in the western horizon they saw some flashes of heat lightning. The wind had fallen, not a leaf moved on the trees. An absolute silence succeeded the noises of the day, and it might be believed that the heavy atmosphere, saturated with electricity, was becoming unfit for the transmission of sounds. Dick Sand, Austin, and Bat watched together. They tried to see, to hear, during this very dark night, if any light whatsoever, or any suspicious noise should strike their eyes or their ears. Nothing troubled either the calm or the obscurity of the forest. Torn, not sleepy, but absorbed in his remembrances, his head bent, remained quiet, as if he had been struck by some sudden blow. Mrs. Weldon rocked her child in her arms, and only thought of him. Only Cousin Benedict slept, perhaps, for he alone did not suffer from the common impression. His faculty for looking forward did not go so far. Suddenly, about 11 o'clock, a prolonged and grave roaring was heard, with which was mingled a sort of sharper shuddering. Tom stood up and stretched out his hand toward a dense thicket, a mile or more distant. Dick Sand seized his arm, but he could not prevent Tom from crying in a loud voice, "The lion, the lion." This roaring, which he had so often heard in his infancy, the old black had just recognized it. "The lion," he repeated. Dick Sand, incapable of controlling himself longer, rushed, cutlass in hand, to the place occupied by Harris. Harris was no longer there, and his horse had disappeared with him. A sort of revelation took place in Dick Sand's mind. He was not where he had believed he was. So it was not on the American coast that the Pilgrim had gone ashore. It was not the Isle of Pax, whose bearing the novice had taken at sea, but some other island situated exactly to the west of this continent, as the Isle of Pax is situated to the west of America. The compass had deceived him during a part of the voyage. We know why. Led away by the tempest over a false route, he must have doubled Cape Horn, and from the Pacific Ocean he had passed into the Atlantic. The speed of his ship, which he could only imperfectly estimate, had been doubled, unknown to him, by the force of the hurricane. Behold why the caoutchouc trees, the quinquinas, the products of South America were missing in this country, which was neither the plateau of Atacama nor the Bolivian pampa. Yes, they were giraffes, not ostriches, which had fled away in the opening. They were elephants that had crossed the thick underwood. They were hippopotami whose repose Dick Sand had troubled under the large plants. It was the tsetse, that dipter picked up by Benedict, the formidable tsetse under whose stings the animals of the caravans perish. Finally, it was, indeed, the roaring of the lion that had just sounded through the forest. And those forks, those chains, that knife of singular form, they were the tools of the slave trader. Those mutilated hands, they were the hands of captives. The Portuguese Negoro and the American Harris must be in collusion. And those terrible words guessed by Dick Sand finally escaped his lips. Africa, Equatorial Africa, Africa of the slave trade and the slaves. End of Part I. Part 2. Chapter 1. The Slave Trade. The slave trade. Nobody is ignorant of the significance of this word, which should never have found a place in human language. This abominable traffic, for a long time practiced to the profit of the European nations which possessed colonies beyond the sea, has been already forbidden for many years. Meanwhile, it is always going on a large scale, and principally in Central Africa. Even in this 19th century, the signature of a few states, calling themselves Christians, are still missing from the Act for the Abolition of Slavery. We might believe that the trade is no longer carried on, that this buying and this selling of human creatures has ceased. It is not so, and that is what the reader must know if he wishes to become more deeply interested in the second part of this history. He must learn what these manhunts actually are still, these hunts which threaten to depopulate a whole continent for the maintenance of a few slave colonies, where and how these barbarous captures are executed, how much blood they cost, how they provoke incendiarism and pillage, finally, for whose profit they are made. It is in the 15th century only that we see the trade in blacks carried on for the first time. Behold under what circumstances it was established. The Mussulmans, after being expelled from Spain, took refuge beyond the strait on the coast of Africa. The Portuguese, who then occupied that part of the coast, pursued them with fury. A certain number of those fugitives were made prisoners and brought back to Portugal. Reduced to slavery, they constituted the first nucleus of African slaves which has been formed in Western Europe since the Christian era. But those Mussulmans belonged, for the most part, to rich families who wished to buy them back for gold. The Portuguese refused to accept a ransom, however large it might be. They had only to make foreign gold. What they lacked were the arms so indispensable then for the work of the growing colonies, and, to say it all, the arms of the slave.